In today's podcast, I interviewed Dr. Stu McGill. Dr. McGill is a professor emeritus at University of Waterloo, where he was a professor for 30 years. His laboratory and experimental research clinic investigated issues related to the causal mechanisms of back pain, how to rehabilitate back pain people, and enhance both injury resilience and performance. His advice is sought often by governments, corporations, legal experts, medical groups, and elite athletes, and teams around the world. His work produced over 250 peer-reviewed scientific journal papers, several textbooks, and many international awards. He's mentored over 40 graduate students during this scientific journey. During this time, he taught thousands of clinicians and practitioners in professional development and continuing education courses around the world. He continues as the Chief Scientific Officer for BackFit Pro, Inc. Difficult back cases are regularly referred to him for consultation. And in today's podcast, we're going to dive in deep into back pain, the causes of back pain, and how to best avoid back pain during workouts, and how to best strengthen the lower back to avoid back pain and back injury. Hey everybody, we're back here on the podcast, and today we have a special guest, Dr. Stu McGill. Welcome, Doctor.
Good morning, Kusha.
Yeah, to get started, what I always like to do is just kind of dive into the interviewee's background and kind of how you came into the field you're in now. So if you could, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, it's not what people think. I was a professor at the University of Waterloo for 32 years. I recently retired, and now I just see mostly athletes as back pain patients here at BackFit Pro, which is halfway between North Bay and Toronto in Canada. But when I was a professor, I ran two different laboratories where we investigated the mechanisms of back pain on cadaveric spines and then on real people. And then I ran a experimental clinic as well. So we didn't generate hypotheses and test them the way usual scientific operations at a university would work. Instead, we would see patients in the clinic, see athletes, and when we couldn't solve their pain puzzle, we then did an experiment to probe the mechanism to see what we could learn. So it was always a great synergy between the clinic and the laboratory. And it was a rather unique way to get an understanding of how the back worked, the various pain mechanisms, how to rehabilitate back pain, and then how to create high performance. And over the years, we were able to restore the careers of many professional athletes, literally hundreds of Olympians from many countries and many different sports. So that's been the story. It's been a lot of fun, and it continues now as we continue to see a few patients here.
Wow, that's great. You know, it's crazy because I feel like in the world of back pain, there's a million books I've seen, there's a million devices and tools. You know, what are some of the, most common mistakes that you think are happening really in the gym that are making people's back pain worse?
Well, that's interesting that you say in the gym, because I would have to say that most of the patients and athletes who come have hurt their backs in the gym, not so much on the competitive field or arena, whatever their arena is, but they make programming mistakes would be number one. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about adaptation, because really training is all about creating the right adaptation. So it breaks my heart when people show me things on social media. People are bragging, this is on my day off, I do 1,000 kettlebell swings, and something else is being bravado about it, when they didn't realize that you train to create an adaptation, and different athletes adapt at different rates, and we're creating well, again, the whole point is to adapt. So great athleticism and back performance is created on the restoration day, not really on the training day. But let me just give a quick analogy about this idea of adaptation. So everyone's familiar with a shoulder and a hip being ball and socket joints, which are meant to create power through a range of motion. But when we go to the discs of a spine, these are not ball and socket joints. They are actually fibers of collagen, layer upon layer in different directions, and they belong to the category of materials called fabrics. And if I wanted to create a tear in my shirt, which is also a composite fabric, I would simply bend it back and forth and stress it like this, and the fibers would slowly pull apart. Well, the discs in your back are exactly the same. So with excessive motion and load, those fibers slowly delaminate and work apart. And people confuse the adaptation in the gym. So now I'll give you, with that background, that these are actually fabrics, they adapt one of two ways. So let's say you do a lot of mobility work through your spine. You might do a lot of gymnastics or yoga or something like that. You will create laxity of the fibers. But the problem with that is if you then confuse the system by placing very high load. So when you look at the inside of a disc of a young person, it's filled with a gel. And now that gel pressurizes when you squeeze and take high load. If the fibers have been adapted to be very loose and pliable, they will slowly delaminate over time with more motion and load, and the nucleus can work its way through and result in a disc bulge or a frank herniation. So most of the athletes that I come and see did too much mobility, or they moved poorly all day long, not exercising spine hygiene. And then they went in the gym and then took that spine adapted to motion, and then I find out they did 10 Olympic lifts, and then they broke form, bent their spine under load, and now they have a disc bulge. So that would be a very potent mechanism of pain and a very common one. Now let's take the opposite kind of person. We'll take a power lifter who then doesn't move their back very much, but they take supreme load. The disc collagen then adapts to become tougher and stronger. Well, the price they pay is it's very difficult for them to tie their own shoes. They don't bend very well. They can't really throw a football, and yet they can pick up 1,000 pounds off the ground, and they have very healthy backs. So do you see, when you mix up those two programming components in the gym, you do 10 burpees and then do 10 Olympic lifts. I quite often say, well, and I hope you enjoy your pain because you just created a program to confuse the adaptation process. Choose one or the other. So that would be the first answer to that question. Another one is it's very popular now for the average person to, as Dan John says, train like a Navy SEAL. For lifelong back health, it's better to be undertrained and rather than overtrained. You will hold on to your athleticism a little bit longer. All systems in biology have a tipping point. If you're below the tipping point, you can keep building the resilience of your body. But when you cross the tipping point, you start to tear down tissues. Back tissues are not like muscle. Muscle repairs within 2 or 3 days and it hypertrophies, etc. But the joints of the spine, the end plates, the discs and whatnot take much longer to adapt. So I think many of the patients I see overtrain. Not respecting anatomy would be another reason. Not everybody can deep squat. It depends on the depth of their hip socket. So when I assess the anatomy of their spine and their hips, and then they tell me, well, I've been pushing deep squats, and I'll say, why? And they say, well, my trainer says I should squat ass to grass, to use their euphemism. And I'll say, but your hips won't allow that. They'll only allow you to go to a certain depth, and then the rest of the motion has to take place in your back. Well, it's okay to have that motion in your back if you don't have load at the same time. But when you have an Olympic bar on your back and you're squatting that deep, you are stressing the discs to the point that they became painful. And yet some violate the principle of spine hygiene. They don't create the capacity to train because of their sloppy behavior and posture throughout the day. So they're not restoring throughout the day as they should, and the cumulative load to the tissues that become sensitized just isn't being created. Anyway, there are just a few random causes of why I see patients, and they're all associated with the activities that they do, not only throughout the day, but specifically in the gym.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, because I think a lot of people don't ever really think about the fact that they've had poor, movement hygiene all day, probably sitting all day at their computer, and then not doing really any proper warm-up. They kind of just jump into, a heavy weightlifting workout, putting a lot of stress on the spine. And then the other thing, too, is I also see a huge trend nowadays, either on one end of the spectrum, it's either guys, or girls doing a lot more yoga in addition to their, traditional weightlifting. So like you said, they have all this mobility, and then they're confusing the system, and then going back to doing heavy weightlifting and kind of not combining the program properly, or not having kind of the right periodization. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have this big CrossFit movement where people are, training like a Navy SEAL, maybe doing too high of intensity, probably chronically overtrained, and probably leading to a lot of the issues they're dealing with as well. So it's interesting that you say that. My next question is, are there certain exercises that people should maybe avoid at the gym? Or are there certain things that you've seen that are just, not a good idea in general?
Well, the answer is absolutely yes. But I can't give you a generic answer for everyone. It's one of those answers that the answer is it depends, and it depends very much on the individual. So whenever I get a patient, I have to perform a fairly in-depth assessment, and that assessment will reveal the mechanism of their pain. So once we've done that, we then figure out a strategy to move in a way that avoids that particular pain trigger. And then slowly over time, that pain trigger desensitizes. Now it's time to build a program to reach their goal in a way that honors that previous injury history. And that's how we build back and restore careers of the athletes. I should also say that you use the word, what's an exercise to avoid? We consider every exercise simply a tool, and you have many tools in your toolbox. What is the goal that you're trying to achieve? Now, go and choose the appropriate tool, the best tool to achieve that goal, with the minimum amount of work, the most sparing of the joints that you can create. In other words, build a training capacity instead of using up the training capacity with the choice of a poor tool. So there's not really a bad exercise that everyone should avoid. Well, maybe there are one or two, but generally speaking, it all comes from the assessment of the person's pain trigger and knowing their goals. And then we will figure out what is the best tool and exercise, what volume of training, what associated exercises we should do, what rest periods we need to do, etc., for that individual.
And so, it's funny because I hear a lot about, in the last probably 5-10 years, I've heard a lot about core training. Nobody ever really talked about core training before. It was always about training your abs, having a six-pack. And now that people are thinking more about being more functional and this idea of functional training, I hear a lot more about the core. But what's really the proper way to build the core? Because when I see people or hear people talk about core training, it sounds like they're just doing ab exercises.
Well, that's a great question. First of all, I would say we've been working on core training for 32 years. So it's nothing new. But before I can really describe why core training, core stiffness, core stability, spine stability, trunk stability, whatever you want to call it, is so important, Let me explain 3 scientific principles so that your viewers will realize why this is a non-negotiable entity. So the first issue is this. We own our body, which is an articulated linkage. So if I wanted to wiggle my finger, which is a distal end of an articulated linkage, I had to stiffen my wrist. If I wanted to wiggle my wrist, I had to stiffen my elbow. And if we use that principle through the linkage, if I want to throw a ball or stand and cut very quickly, I had to create proximal stability. Well, the proximal part of your body, the mother of all proximity, is your core or your torso. So let me explain that now with a specific example. Let's say I could bench press 200 kilos, 440 pounds. I can't, but let's say I could. Now I want to use that and push people. I box on the NFL line, or I might be a combat athlete or whatever. I want to create a push. Let's use your bench press muscle, which is pec major. Pec major crosses the ball and socket joint, so it's meant for creating power. Distal to my shoulder, it creates arm flexion, so a very powerful pushing, punching motion. But proximally, that muscle connects to my rib cage. So its action is to bend the rib cage towards the shoulder. So if I push just using my bench press muscle, I am very ineffective because I'm collapsing proximally as I'm creating distal athleticism. However, when I stiffen down my core and arrest all the motion, 100% of that muscle activity is now directed to the distal athleticism. So consider the hip. If I plant, externally rotate, and extend to change direction, if I had a wonky core, my spine bends and I lose velocity, precision, and I actually also stress the spine and create what's called a stress riser. So proximal stability or core stability is non-negotiable. It's absolutely essential for walking, running, getting on and off the toilet, etc. Because we have an articulated linkage. Now, the next anatomical feature that we have is the spine is a flexible rod. So I'm going to create a flexible rod, but I'm going to tighten the wire in it to simulate compression down through the spine. So now my muscles in creating core fitness are contracting, and they stiffen the spine, which has a lordotic low back curve, a kyphotic thoracic curve. And notice I can push and boss around that spine and it doesn't collapse. That's the role of the guy wire system of the core, which isn't only the abdominals, it's quadratus lumborum, it's psoas, it's the back muscles, it's the obliques, it's rectus, it's the full family forming the hoop and the guy wire system around the core. Now, if I take the compressive load off that spine, you'll see it collapses and bends very quickly. And we've measured that bending collapse in athletes through video fluoroscopy and electromyography and whatnot. So again, if I want to hold load and do a farmer's carry or something, it's non-negotiable. I have to activate the core muscles to allow this articulated linkage with a flexible spine to bear load. Now, the third non-negotiable element of core stiffness has to do directly with pain control. So here's a model where we've created a laxity just at this particular joint here because of a little bit of overload on that disc. And all of these models, by the way, are produced by a company called dynamicdiscdesigns.com, who've created fabulous models to show what it is we've documented in the laboratory and clinic over the past 30 years. So imagine the person bends over to do a deadlift or a power clean or something like that. Watch when I push the spine, you'll see the majority of the motion takes place right at this joint. This joint is stiff and this joint is stiff. So do you see how that load creates a micro movement? And when I twist, the majority of the movement goes to the joint that has had a little bit of damage. Just like if you tore a knee ligament, for example, you do a drawer test you would find a micro movement there. Well, that joint becomes a little bit sensitive and angry. You can see the red on the facet joints, for example, because they are taking the majority of the stress and the movement. But core stiffness and fitness arrests those micro movements. So now if you were to instruct the person, just push my fingers out laterally, not forward, but laterally, maintain that tone, and now run and cut or lift the kettlebell or whatever it happens to be. If that's the mechanism and we've tuned the muscular response correctly, they will then say, oh, you've now arrested my pain and I can carry on with my training. So there's 3 mechanisms that we can measure and quantify. And knowing that, we now have a very specific targeted strategy of a form of core fitness, core stiffness, spine stability, whatever term you want to use, to engineer out that mechanism and restore their pain-free activity.
That's great. Now, what are your thoughts on things like standing desks or treadmill desks? I know a lot of people are big on those to help with their back pain, but do those really, really help, or do they really do anything for back pain?
Well, the answer is, once again, it depends on the mechanism of back pain for that individual, and the assessment, if it's thorough enough, will show them what their mechanism is. If it turns out that sitting is driving their back pain, and I would start simply with the question, what causes your back pain? And if the person says, well, going for a walk takes my pain away, but sitting at the computer for half an hour really ramps up my back pain, I would then say, well, here, put your hand between your low back and the backrest. And if they say, oh, yeah, that reduces my pain, well, I would give them a lumbar support, for example. I would give them some core stabilization exercises that didn't bend their spine into the pain mechanism. And then I might suggest a sit-stand workstation if their job forces them to be a slave to the computer. Yep. So now you've migrated the stress away from the pain trigger by standing. But then to talk about treadmills, I think that came on, and like every new thing, people get on the bandwagon. I don't think it really stuck, though. It's difficult to walk on a treadmill and do your work. Mm-hmm. And my own bias towards that is it's a bit rat-like, being a rat on the treadmill. And I think I'm wearing a T-shirt today. I am. It says, stop exercising and start training. So stop being a rat on a treadmill and be much more cerebral and thoughtful about organizing your training to address the cause of your pain and strategically building a foundation for pain-free movement. I don't think walking on a treadmill trying to do your computer work is the mindful approach that we're looking for to create a resilient body.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, what about cardio? I know that there's all types of cardio machines you see at the gym. You see treadmills, ellipticals, and whatnot. And the idea behind certain things like ellipticals is that it's lower impact. And are there certain forms of cardio or certain machines that might be better than others? In terms of, reducing stress on the spine or improving, reducing back pain?
Absolutely. But the answer is, once again, it depends on the individual. Most people will do well with short interval walks throughout the day. Walking is non-negotiable for back health. It's the best way to challenge and activate prime stabilizers like the quadratus lumborum, for example. It creates hip movement. It's just an exercise or an activity that, once again, is non-negotiable and you can't get away from. But having said that, you use the words machines. Well, again, I'm not a fan of the typical treadmill replacement for walking because we've measured the mechanics quite change, and it's not the stress step-free type of gait pattern that we're trying to produce with overland walking. And then you mentioned elliptical trainers. Well, elliptical trainers are something else that we've measured and quantified as well. It's interesting that some patients will tell you after training on the elliptical, it helps their back pain. The next person comes in and says, you know, that triggers my back pain, and we wondered why. So we did cluster analysis, and what we found was those who were relieved with back pain had mobile hips. Those who the elliptical caused their back pain had much less hip mobility. And as it turned out, when they were on the elliptical, their hips ran out of movement, and then their spine then started to dance along with every step, and that actually caused back pain. And if you want to find that out, just put an Olympic bar on your back and do a pelvic tilt back and forth, and they'll do it 10 times. Some people will trigger into back discomfort right away simply from that. So you'll realize that their spines don't like motion, and then the next person does very well. What we also measured, though, with elliptical trainers, they are very gluteal centric. So when you're on an elliptical trainer, it really stimulates and requires more input from the gluteal muscles. So we talked about tools before. Mm-hmm. If you want a tool that is very gluteal centric and you want a walking cardio classification of tool, an elliptical might be a very appropriate choice. But make sure they qualify by having the mobile hips. You don't want a stiff-hipped hockey player, for example, mm-hmm. on a elliptical. So there's a very high-level discussion, and we have these discussions on every single thing. It's never a yes, no, or mm-hmm. Yes, we like it, no, we don't. You do a thorough assessment and let that guide your decision-making.
That makes a lot of sense. What about stretching? Are there certain types of stretching, like static stretching versus dynamic, or, even foam rolling? Are there certain things that might be helpful or certain things that might make it worse?
Absolutely. So what's the answer?
Yeah, well, we know it depends. That's for sure.
It depends. That's the answer. Absolutely. So, again, what is the pain mechanism? Some people ruin their athleticism by stretching too much. Mm-hmm. When I measure the great athletes, the great dunkers in the NBA, do you think they have loose hamstrings?
No, exactly.
Oh, they're tuned springs. They jump off the spring. It's every golfer, every baseball pitcher, every power lifter, they've tuned their bodies to have the appropriate stiffness to store and recover elastic energy. Mm-hmm. So, I don't ever consider stretching as a way to create mobility, as so many trainers and people do. A lot of them cause back pain that way. Instead, stretching is part of your toolbox to tune the elasticity of the person's body. Again, I need to know what the goals are. I need to assess their body. I need to assess their pain triggers, and then we'll determine what strategic stability and stiffness and mobility they need throughout their body, and then we'll tune the springs. And we have various tools for doing that. You mentioned foam rolling. It is so disheartening when I have a patient come in with spine laxity. They have a painful micro movement at a joint, and I'll say, tell me about your daily routine. And they say, well, I try and foam roll my back. Mm-hmm. And it's awful that foam roller has pushed full body weight on that spinous process. And yet when I touch it with my thumb and apply 1 kilo, they break into pain. They have produced back pain with foam rolling it. Mm-hmm. So we would never, ever, ever take a lacrosse ball or a foam roller to a low back. Now, I don't know anything about thighs or shoulders or even latissimus dorsi, but I do know about the low back. Please never foam roll. Instead, address the cause. Find out the mechanism of the pain and address it appropriately.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I've had back pain in the past, and foam rolling the back never resulted in a positive response. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, what about supplements or foods? Are there certain things that could be helpful? I mean, one thing that comes to mind are things like probiotics, maybe reducing gastroinflammation or bloating or something like that. Is there anything along that line of thought that might be helpful?
Well, I could have a very short discussion or a very long discussion with you on that one. I'll try and strike a balance here. I've heard all kinds of claims about nutritional supplements and hydration and special diets and gut inflammation, etc., as a cause of back pain. Very rarely is this the dominant variable and mechanism for a person's pain. Now, having said that, of course, there is the odd person where their gut is in an uproar and it's a certainly a player in their back pain. But if most people think they're going to take a supplement and this is going to solve their back pain, they're dreaming. The way to do it is assess the mechanism, know what that is, and take away the mechanism to allow the pain desensitization. Very rarely is the most dominant feature of the mechanism nutritional. Now, if the person just doesn't know how to eat and they eat like a child, then of course, they at least get those things that they're able to manage addressed. I've heard some people say, well, when you irritate the gut, you can't activate the abdominal wall correctly and, stop eating spicy foods and whatnot. Well, I've worked with some of the top Olympians in the world. When you work with some of the Eastern Europeans, for example, the top Olympic weightlifters, do you know what they eat before the Olympics? They eat a spicy meal, which charges them up to give them that blast. So, that should be a little bit of a teleological argument. They've got it dialed in. They know how to really optimize the performance in their body. And I've tried very spicy diets to see if we can register a change in how a person recruits their abdominal wall. We've found nothing that we can measure. So there is the short answer. If you're looking for nutrition as the biggest variable to manipulate to reduce your back pain, I think you will fail.
That makes a lot of sense. It seems like it's probably a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator like movement and strength and things like that. It definitely seems like it's probably a minor thing at best. So that makes a lot of sense to me. What about sleep? This is another thing I was thinking about the other day. What's the best position and how does that play into it?
The best position for what?
For sleeping. What's the best? Should I be sleeping on my back? Should I be sleeping on my side? Should I have something between my knees?
Yes. Well, the answer is, 2 words.
Yeah, it depends.
It depends. So again, the assessment will guide the answer to the individual. If a person turns out to have a pain trigger associated with bending their spine a certain way, so say you lay them on the exam table on their tummy and you say, put your hands palms down, turn your head and just lay there. And after 3 or 4 minutes, if the patient says, you know what, my pain is ramping down, then I would say, have you ever tried sleeping on your tummy in bed? Or at least the last hour before you get up in the morning, just roll and lay on your tummy. So there would be a very wise thing to do. But if the person lays there and says, oh, that extended posture, my back is causing pain, then you wouldn't. You would probably ask them to lay on their side or lay on your back. Now, put your hands palms down under your low back between your back and the bed mattress. Oh, that's very comfortable. That just took my pain away. So we're searching through experiment ways to desensitize their back and find the optimal sleeping posture for them. So generally speaking, unbeknownst, here's another question I might ask. Tell me about the character of your pain. And if they say, well, I wake up with morning stiffness, and then after an hour, it's all gone, and I have a good time for the rest of the day. I'm going to investigate their mattress and their sleeping habits at that point. So I'll say, do you have a floppy mattress? And if they have a floppy mattress that really deviates their spine, and when I put their spine in that position and they say, yeah, that mimics my pain, I'll have to recommend, I think you need a new mattress, get a firmer mattress, but put a significant pillow top for softness on top of a firm mattress. Mm-hmm. And many of them will come back and say, that did make a difference in my morning pains. But these are all just interesting discussions. It's interesting from an anthropological point of view when you go around the world and you measure the different anatomies of people's backs, and then you measure their sleeping habits, and you'll find out why certain haplogroups or countries, for example, sleep on certain types of bedding. For example, if you take a northeastern, and I'm thinking particularly of a Japanese person who has, when you measure the standing lordosis, it will be less. In other words, the back tends to be a little bit flatter. Now, you could, you'll see that many of them will sleep on a hard board like a futon, for example. And yet then you would take a European spine or some African spines that have a lot more lordosis. If they lay on a futon, they're in terrible pain the next morning because the buttocks and the thoracic part of the spine are taking the load, and the lordotic spine is flattening into high stress. So there's just an example how you might find tummy laying, for example, to be very prevalent in certain parts of the world. And you might find flat back lying on a futon to be another commonality in other cultures. And people say, well, it's just because they're exposed to that. Not really, because when you measure those gene pools, when they change location and culture, the shapes characteristic of certain gene pools remain. So anyway, these are all fabulous discussions to have, but it doesn't matter where the person's from. What matters is they have a thorough assessment of what's causing their back pain, precisely match the appropriate intervention, and reduce the chronic stress. So these are all fabulous questions, but it always boils down to simply that: assess, precisely know the trigger, and address it.
What are your thoughts on hanging and inversion tables for back pain relief?
What's the answer?
I think we know at this point. It's definitely going to be. It
well,
depends.
Again, I've measured. This is going back about 25 years, hanging upside down, and there's no question the spine discs are hydrophilic, and there's a diurnal variation to the fluid levels within the disc. So when you wake up in the morning, your spine is actually swollen. It's much harder to bend first thing in the morning. In fact, the bending stresses are 3 times higher than when you went to bed the night before. Well, hanging upside down causes fluid to flow into the discs. So the height is restored, they're plumped up a little bit. As soon as you get off the inversion table or hanging upside down, within about 15 minutes, normal height is restored once again. So what does that do? Well, on the positive side, it would add a little bit of joint space. You would change the fluid level within the nucleus of the disc and quite possibly get some nutrition to the disc. That's certainly been discussed. On the negative side, you get very high pressure in your eyeballs, and if I do it, I get dizzy and a headache. There are much better ways if traction does give relief, and it may be a relief just from a stretch reflex, which is probably something you don't want to listen to if you're trying to get rid of back pain. That causes overstretching and overtraction. But there's a group of people, and they are usually older people with more arthritic mechanisms to their back pain where they do find relief with some traction strategies, but usually it's a horizontal traction and they don't get the vascular concerns of hanging upside down and reversing the blood pressure to be very high in their head. So there's a beginning of that discussion, but at the end of the day, it's certainly something that we would not go to and choose that as a tool to create a traction effect on the back.
That makes a lot of sense. What about, one of the things that's been really interesting is I used to study under a guy named Dr. Cobb at a place called Z Health in Arizona, and he looked a lot at kind of the neurology of exercise. And he talked about these like spinal pathways from the eyes and the inner ear, the vestibular system, and these different reflexes we had, and talked about how back pain maybe could be caused by maybe imbalance in the vestibular system or the vision system. Have you seen anything like that where maybe someone's vision system or vestibular system is playing a role in their back pain or some of their reflexes in their back pain? Or
well, the answer is yes, we have. And a simple experiment to do there is just have a person stand and then stand on one leg. Then repeat it a third time, stand on one leg and close your eyes. And you will find a spectrum of variability of response. Some people place a very high priority on the visual feedback to maintain their balance and the way that they activate their muscles. If they are in peril, they'll either do one of two things. They'll either stiffen up, which again, they will pay a price in terms of if they have compressive triggered back pain, there's a mechanism, or they get the opposite. They fall apart and just flop. So it depends. Just like when we talk about every individual, sometimes it plays a higher role and sometimes it's irrelevant. But we usually, when we're testing the strategy now for intervention, if they're an athlete, say they're a lifting athlete, we'll have them fix their gaze at a certain level and lock onto that for the whole lifting movement, and we'll measure the response. Then we'll change their gaze to some other location, and then we might say, close your eyes and repeat. And we'll find out if vision for them is important in executing a movement engram that spares their back and pulls out performance. But we would do exactly the same thing. People say, well, should we lift barefoot or should we lift in lifting shoes? And I'll say, good. I don't know the answer until we test it. Yeah. Let's lift in barefoot. Now I'm going to give you a pair of Olympic lifting shoes, which are very hard soles. We buckle you in. We squeeze the hell out of your feet. Some people, all of a sudden, they clean up. They execute power. They get beautiful power transmission out of the hips. Their core is tight. It's a fabulous lift. And then we put them in bare feet and they fall apart. The next person shows us exactly the opposite response. So that's the answer to the question and how we would go about resolving it to see if A, it's important to that individual, and B, if it is, what strategy do they need to create pain-free movement.
Awesome. Well, that pretty much wraps up my questions for today. This has been an awesome podcast. Definitely the most revealing and most clarifying even for me. Having back pain in the past and sometimes occasional back pain. This has definitely changed the way I look at back pain and just even the way that you use the demonstrations with the props that you have there. Really changes the way you kind of look at what's actually happening there, because I don't think a lot of people realize what's actually happening at the spinal level, what's happening at the disc level in reality. So I think that was really, really clarifying and really helpful. And I think if any of our viewers want to learn more, they can go to backfitpro.com, correct, and learn more about your books and programs and the things you offer, as well as, it sounds like, Amazon.com and the various Amazon marketplaces if you're in a different country to learn more about you, correct?
Yes. If I could summarize this, Kusha, by saying back pain always has a cause. these poor people who've been told they have non-specific back pain, it's just a tragedy, or worse yet, they've been told it's in their head. It isn't. There's always a cause. The book that I wrote for the lay public is called Back Mechanic. And it guides the person through a self-assessment of their pain triggers and then shows them how to practice spine hygiene, wind down what's triggering their pain and wind down the sensitivity. And then it shows them basic movement forms to build a pain-free life. And then if they have any performance or training goals at all, I then transition them into the next book. It can't be the same book now because they're out of pain, but we honor their previous injury history. Ultimate Back Fitness and Performance guides them through how to then build lift, push, pull, carrying patterns, etc. And if they're a strength athlete, the most recent book I wrote with Brian Carroll, who was the first power lifter to ever squat over 1,000 pounds 50 times in national and international competition. But he came to me with a horrific back injury, and it tells the story of Brian's recovery from that injury and his day-to-day training log and how he organized his return, and he won the Arnold's twice once again after recovering from that horrific injury. So back pain, it's not a life sentence for most people. It's a matter of knowing the cause and addressing it appropriately. But all of those are on backfitpro.com or on Amazon as well.
Awesome. Wow, this has definitely been one of the best podcasts we've had by far. And again, thank you so much for being on the podcast. And we look forward to having you back on the podcast again in the future.
Okay, Kusha, thank you very much for all you do.
Thanks.